For thousands of years, eclipses have mesmerized humankind. As daylight briefly retreats into darkness and the moon turns blood red. The ancients considered eclipses as omens of impending doom, but today we see them as potentially heralding extraordinarily fortunate outcomes as well. In other words, it's complicated. As we head swiftly into August, which features a solar eclipse in Leo and a lunar eclipse in Pisces, let's unpack just what eclipses mean in astrology so you have a better idea of what to expect. So what makes eclipses so confusing and so difficult to predict in terms of astrology? Well, they're not uniform in their effects. Some eclipses affect some people very profoundly. That same eclipse could not affect another person at all. Again, some countries will experience the effects of it profoundly and other parts of the world don't. Part of it is that eclipses aren't like normal transits in that they, in a way, open a window of time during which something could but won't necessarily occur. And depending on the modality of the sign in which the eclipse is occurring, whether it's fixed, cardinal, or mutable, this window could be anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, upwards of a year. It's a tricky astrological phenomenon to derive predictive work from, and so they can be pretty tricky sometimes. Now, one major distinction that I think many don't focus on, but to me it is the most crucial distinction, is whether the eclipse is occurring on the south node of the moon or the north node of the moon. So without getting too scientific, the lunar orbit is tilted relative to the Earth at a 5-degree angle. So the moon is going up and then down very slightly. And most months, it's too high or too low relative to the Earth and the sun to produce an eclipse. But when it crosses exactly the ecliptic plane, that is when an eclipse will occur, because the moon is exactly aligned between the Earth and sun during a solar eclipse, or it's on the other side, aligned up exactly to the Earth, which is in front of the moon during a lunar eclipse. And because of this tilt, when the moon is ascending upward, that point of alignment is called the north node. And then when it's descending downward, again, because it's tilted at 5 degrees, that is considered the south node, and it's descending down. And astrologically, there's a big difference between these 2 points. When the moon is heading north at the north node, that is considered as a point of increase, where we have an inflow of celestial energy coming into Earth and infusing our collective consciousness. The south node is the opposite. When the moon is at the south node, that is a release point. And if you think about it, it's like sitting in a stuffy room with no circulation. You need airflow, otherwise the air becomes stagnant, just like energy. And without that flow, things stagnate. It's not good. And so the problem is, unlike a stuffy room where you're just dealing with stuffy air, you don't get attached to air. You do get attached, however, to energetic signatures, because everything is energy. It's everything. Whether it's a place, whether it's a person, whether it's an object, whether it's an idea, whether it's some aspect of ourselves, they all have energetic signatures, and those things flow out when during a south node eclipse. Because eclipses, the north and south node are always channeling energy, so there's always an inflow and outflow at any given point. You don't need an eclipse to trigger this, but eclipses magnify everything. So it's like, if you can imagine a bathtub where the exact same amount of water is going in that is going out from the drain, but it's like a drip. When eclipses occur, the faucet gets turned up all the way, and so does the drain. And so there are points in which energy flows quite quickly. Now, this does not mean that everybody feels eclipses the same way. On an individual level, a lot of it depends on the points in your chart which are getting hit by the North Node and the South Node when an eclipse occurs. And that's part of the reason why some people have, there's no effect for some people. And for others, there can be profound effects, essentially. So it's very individualized in terms of what sort of effects that they produce. Now, in a very general sense, North Node eclipses are considered more positive than South Node eclipses. And again, it's because when the eclipse occurs on the North Node, we're getting fresh cosmic energy coming in. So this can manifest as new people coming into our life, new ideas, new opportunities, new ways of relating to ourselves and others. Whereas with the South Node, it's often a time of saying goodbye, whether it's to a person, whether it's to an idea, whether it's to any attachment that we have. And our level of attachment is going to be commensurate with the level of challenge when whatever that is happens to be draining out. And again, it doesn't mean that people necessarily, pass away, although that sometimes does happen, but the energy is being channeled out of our consciousness. And because quite often the things that are being released during a South Node eclipse can be things that we are attached to some extent, they are seen as more challenging. But that's not always the case. Also, South Node eclipses can be seen as physically draining our vitality in a way. So many people have reported when they have a South Node eclipse occurring right over a personal planet or a sensitive angle, such as the ascendant, that they just feel tired, that they feel drained, and can just be a time where sometimes you just need to lay low and focus on self-care and all of that. So it can manifest in a very literal way as well. Now, is there a difference between lunar and solar eclipses from an astrological standpoint? Well, in my experience, not really. At least not on a collective level, not in terms of actual events that occur. I would say individually, sometimes because during a lunar eclipse, the moon is the object that is eclipsed, and the moon represents our emotional landscape, our feelings, that sometimes it can manifest in a more internalized way, where whether it is emotional processing, whether it is something that, it may not be triggered by a specific external event, but it can manifest as insights, as revelations, as downloads, if you will. But on a collective level, the moon represents way more than that. A lot of times in mundane astrology, which is the astrology of predicting world events, the moon signifies the people, the population. So she plays a much more prominent role in external affairs when it comes to mundane astrology than she does on a personal level. Again, part of the reason why eclipses don't hit everybody is it generally needs to occur within 3 degrees of a personal planet. So we're talking about your natal sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, or Mars. Not to say that it hitting Saturn, Jupiter, or the outer planets couldn't trigger an effect, because they could, but because those first 5 planets are more personalized, more central to our personalities, to our ego, to our sense of self, you'll feel it more acutely. And the same goes for the angles, especially the ascendant and descendant, but also the midheaven and the IC, the Imum Coli, which represents the very top of the chart and the very root of the chart. Lastly, why is it that some eclipses trigger windows where it could be months before a significant event occurs, and why others can produce an event immediately or within a week? Well, part of it is, as I said before, when eclipses happen in fixed signs are durable, lasting. They are considered as having much longer effects because that is the nature of fixed energy. Cardinal is more fast incoming. So cardinal eclipses, when they occur in the signs of Aries, Cancer, Libra, or Capricorn, it's going to have a smaller window, we'll say a couple of months. Mutables, so mutable energy, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, is transitioning. It's double bodied. It is a transition from fixed energy into cardinal. It is a cycling of fixed to cardinal. And so it can be sporadic. You could have something happen within a week and then something happen a month or two later. So it's a bit more of a wild card. And lastly, a lot of it depends on what exactly was going on in the sky at the moment of the eclipse. What aspects were the planets making to each other? What were the dignities of the planets? And what planet ruled the eclipse? And what sort of activity was going on? For example, Uranus is a planet of quick, sudden, shocking events. So when you get a very strong Uranian eclipse, where Uranus is featuring prominently in the sky, even if it's in a fixed sign, you can expect there to be some pretty quick results from that afterwards, if not immediate, because that's the nature of Uranus. Whereas if it's more of a Saturnian eclipse, if Saturn is the most prominent planet during that eclipse, then it might be more of a slow burn, or it might just be a slow building up of pressure after the eclipse, or a slow release after the eclipse. And finally, a way to think about eclipses is that it creates a supercharge of energy where both the eclipse point and its polarity point, so the point on the other side of the zodiac, and to a lesser extent, the 2 points at 90 degrees that are squaring the eclipse, become supercharged. They become sensitive points that when a planet aspects those points, especially through a conjunction, opposition, or square, it can trigger something, but not until a transit triggers it. So we can just sort of see it as creating these sensitive points that depending on what the subsequent transits are, could produce an effect. And of course, that's going to depend on the nature of the planet involved and the signs involved, all of that. And so for these reasons, I would say it's not fully accurate to look at eclipse as a transit in and of itself, but more as a portal in which events could occur. And it helps frame the way astrologers look at the subsequent transits. Because again, if sensitive points are activated, then you can fairly expect in somewhere in the world, something is going to happen. So one way to highlight some of these concepts I've discussed is by looking at example charts. Now, the one I've selected is actually for the really devastating earthquake that occurred in Turkey back in 2023. Now, I'm not always doom and gloom about chart examples, but the reason why I like to use earthquakes as examples is it is an energetic release in a quite literal sense. But more importantly, because we have such advanced equipment across the globe, we can pinpoint the exact moment when an earthquake occurs. And so, unlike other events where, especially like events that involve socio-political or social things, sometimes it can be difficult to trace exactly what set off the chain of events that occurred. With earthquakes, we know exactly when. It's a very clear, exact moment in time. We can pinpoint it, and we can also obviously pinpoint the exact moment of the eclipse. So we know what, how far after an eclipse something occurred. So this is the chart of the lunar eclipse that occurred about 4 months before the devastating earthquake that struck eastern Turkey and northern Syria. What I did is I cast the chart for the exact moment of the eclipse at the local time in Gaziantep, Turkey, because I think when we get a snapshot of what was going on in the sky local to the place where the event actually occurred, we get a much better idea because we can see the actual angles of the eclipse. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that this lunar eclipse was exactly conjunct Uranus. And you might be thinking, oh, well, I thought you said that Uranus produces immediate results. And that is just a generality. There's a couple factors here that are slowing Uranus down. First of all, Uranus is retrograde. So when planets are retrograde, they aren't as capable of producing direct effects as they do when they're direct. Secondly, Uranus at this point was still in Taurus. Taurus is fixed Earth. This is Uranus is a fast planet, but it gets bogged down in a fixed sign like Taurus, especially fixed Earth. Secondly, this eclipse is getting squared by Saturn, which was my other example that I used of a slow moving planet that slows other planets down. And Saturn is right on the ascendant here. So Saturn is even slowing this down even further. I would say without the retrograde, if this were happening in like maybe even mutable Earth, like Virgo, and Uranus was direct, there might have been more immediate results, but it may not have been an earthquake. So anyways, this doesn't mean that Saturn here is going to prevent a negative outcome from occurring at all. It's just slowing things down. What else do we see? Well, Jupiter is in its traditional domicile of Pisces, but Jupiter is also retrograde, and it's at the anaretic degree, which is considered a challenging degree for a planet to be in as a general rule. What we see here is that Jupiter is also actually in the square to Mars, the other malefic, so it's got its hands full with that. And Venus is very close to the sun. She is being basically burnt by the rays of the sun, which diminishes her effectiveness in preventing unfortunate outcomes from happening, which is what Venus does. And she's also in detriment in Scorpio. So there's a number of factors here that are clearing the way for something to happen. And this is a north node lunar eclipse. But again, the sun is on the south node. So here the energy is flowing into fixed Earth and being released through Scorpio. Furthermore, this is occurring, a lot of the planetary energy, the preponderance of planetary energy is in the fixed signs. Whenever we see, again, fixed eclipses are not always going to produce these sorts of things, but they're in angular houses relative to the locality where the event occurred. There's a malefic on the ascendant squaring the planet of shocking disruptive events, squaring the eclipse because Uranus is conjunct the moon during this lunar eclipse. So we're seeing a number of factors here that do point to a challenging event that could occur slowly after the eclipse window. And lastly, because this is a fixed eclipse, the eclipse window is 6 months or possibly longer. So here is the chart of the actual earthquake itself. So I cast a chart for the exact moment, 4:17 a.m. in Gaziantep, Turkey. And what we can see here is a number of things that are going on, including a triggering of the eclipse point. First of all, Uranus, if you recall, was retrograde during the eclipse itself, which occurred back in November of 2022. It had since stationed direct, I would say about a week before this earthquake, and had begun moving back towards the eclipse point. Now remember, I had mentioned that the eclipse point becomes a charged degree and in a fixed sign if the eclipse occurs in a fixed sign, that degree becomes charged for a period of 6 months or sometimes longer. So Uranus had just entered, it had just gotten within that 1 degree window of where that eclipse occurred at 16 degrees exact of Taurus. What else do we see? Well, there was a full moon that occurred. So this earthquake happened just a mere hours after the full moon became exact, which was at 16 degrees of Leo. So this full moon was also squaring the prior eclipse that had happened in Taurus. Again, fixed signs. The fact that all of this was occurring in fixed signs really is an indicator that this is something that we commonly see in earthquakes. We have the Sun applying quickly to this conjunction with Saturn, who was a major player in the eclipse itself, being right on the ascendant in Aquarius. And so what we're seeing here is a concentration of energy piling up to cause a significant event. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, going back to the eclipse chart itself, is that we also want to take a look at the planet that is ruling the eclipse. And in a lunar eclipse, it's always a planet ruling the sign where the moon is. In this case, it's Taurus, and Taurus is ruled by Venus. As I mentioned before, this Venus was not in good shape. She was too close to the sun. Kind of being burned up is sort of figuratively what we say. So she's not at her strongest. She's also in detriment in Scorpio. So again, as a ruler of the eclipse, she is not in the best condition to prevent unfortunate outcomes. But anyway, to go back to the event chart itself, what we see here is that even though there's not, we have the Sun square Uranus, right? There's not much going on. We do have this Venus square Mars. Venus is exalted at this point, right? And Jupiter is no longer retrograde. But what we see is that what is a major factor here is the activation of the eclipse point. And that can quite often override what could otherwise be intervening factors that could prevent the event from occurring. So again, you can look at eclipses as setting in place certain conditions that if those conditions are met, at some point during the eclipse window, an event will occur. And lastly, to go just quickly back to Uranus. So recall that Uranus was retrograde, right? So being retrograde, it wasn't in its full power, so to speak. It is now direct, so it's more forward movement, more forward action, moving back towards the eclipse degree, and it is no longer under this square from Saturn, and it is now able to produce outcomes that it was inhibited from in the preceding few months. So I hope you found this video helpful. I hope that it shined a light, demystified some aspects of eclipses. I wanted to include a good example eclipse to counterbalance this, and maybe I will at some point, but I wanted to get this video out, and I've got the other video, which will be coming out soon, which is the breakdown of the solar eclipse in Leo, which I'm actually really, I think it's going to be amazing. So if you liked this video, keep an eye out for that one. And if you liked this video, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping. All of that stuff really helps this brand new channel. So very much appreciate it, and take care. We'll catch you next time.